The land stretched until it gave up and became sky. Nothing broke the horizon but dust devils and fence posts, both bent by time, neither asking for pity. Wyoming, high and dry, July heat simmering off the plain like the last breath of something dying slow. Samuel Cutter moved with the silence of someone who'd learned not to need sound. He was a big man, but not in the way that took up space. His shadow was longer than his voice. Every morning he woke before the light and listened, to the creak of wood under his boots, to the wind slipping through gaps in the boards, to the shifting weight of cattle somewhere beyond the barn. He carried his coffee to the porch without ceremony, sitting just so the edge of the sun touched his boots but not his eyes. The ranch wasn't much. A single longhouse made from hand-hewn pine, barn half collapsing on its east side, a windmill that turned slow as thought. 50 head of cattle scattered over a dozen square miles of dry grass and brush, fences forever needing mending. That kind of life, not a soul around for miles. He had lived this rhythm for years, since his wife, a woman never spoken of, not even in memory, had gone. No grave marker on the land. Just the absence of her, folded into every part of it. The mail came once a week, if the postwriter remembered. Most weeks he didn't. But that day, one arrived, a young boy with sunburnt cheeks and a jaw too proud for his years. He handed Samuel a single cream-colored envelope with shaky fingers, then rode off before being offered water. Samuel didn't open it for a while. He placed it on the windowsill, letting the corner curl in the heat. Only when the sun began to set, when the shadows pulled long across the floorboards, did he break the seal with the edge of his knife. The handwriting was feminine, ornate, like it was written for someone who cared about that kind of thing. A wedding, it said. July 17th. Chapel of Calico Bluff. You are welcome, it added at the end, as if the invitation had come reluctantly. He read it twice, then folded it again, slower the second time. He hadn't been invited. Not truly. He hadn't spoken to anyone in Calico Bluff for 3 winters now, save for trading hides and salt once or twice. He didn't know the name Josephine Ash, the bride. Or maybe he did, somewhere deep under the years. Still, when the sun rose the next morning, he saddled his horse, a pale Appaloosa named Hollow, and rode south with a tin flask in one pocket and nothing to say. Calico Bluff rose from the prairie like a fever dream, wood planks bleached white by years of wind and sermons, 1 saloon, 1 general store, 2 streets. The chapel stood on the hill above town, whitewashed but weathered, leaning just slightly to the left. The bell had already rung by the time Samuel arrived. He tied Hollow to a post outside the saloon, nodded to the old man spitting tobacco into the dust, and walked up the chapel steps with his hat in hand. Not to attend, not really. He didn't know why he came, just that something in him was pulling toward it. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and lilies, wooden pews filled with townsfolk in stiff collars and sunburnt faces. A preacher stood near the pulpit, his hands folded, his eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. Murmurs floated like gnats in the hot air. And there she was, at the front, alone, the bride. She stood like a tree struck by lightning, upright but forever changed. Her dress was simple, no lace or pearls, just ivory cotton that hung heavy in the summer heat. A single strand of hair stuck to her cheek. Her hands were wrapped around a bouquet of pale desert flowers, not trembling, just still. The man wasn't there, the one she was supposed to marry. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The murmurs grew teeth. An older woman whispered something cruel behind a gloved hand. A boy snickered. The preacher cleared his throat too many times. But Josephine Ash didn't cry. She just stared at the door, not blinking, like maybe she could will him into existence. Samuel stood at the back, his hat pressed to his chest. Something in him stilled. All the dust and silence in his bones rearranged, made room for something else. And then, slow as dusk falling over the land, he walked forward. Boots thudding against pine, one step after another, no words, not a sound. He came to stand beside her, tall and calm. No question in his eyes, no offer either, just presence. The murmurs stopped. Josephine turned her head just enough to look at him. Not surprise, not really. Just a long, searching look, like she was trying to remember where she'd seen him before. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe it didn't matter. Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. Samuel didn't touch her, didn't move, just nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The preacher, after a long, stunned moment, opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. He closed his book, stepped back from the pulpit. The church emptied slowly, people unsure where to look, whispers trying not to be heard, dust rising in shafts of light through the high windows. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old copper. Thunderheads gathered far off, promising rain that wouldn't come. Josephine walked out of the chapel. Samuel followed. They rode back to the ranch in silence, two silhouettes against the dying light. The land didn't question them. The wind didn't ask why. By nightfall, the chapel stood empty again. Only the lilies remained, drying slowly in the heat, their petals curling inward like they too had been abandoned. The ride back was long and open. The prairie unfolded in waves, yellow and brittle, like paper ready to burn. Sky above, earth below, and nothing in between but two figures moving slow under the weight of what wasn't said. Samuel Cutter didn't look at her much, not directly. He kept his eyes on the trail, his back straight in the saddle, reins loose in his hand. But his body leaned slightly toward her when the wind rose, and once, when her mare startled at a rabbit bolting from the brush, his hand moved toward her reins without thinking, a reflex, nothing more, like a man who still knew how to protect, even if he no longer remembered why. Josephine Ashe rode with her back stiff, her veil tucked into her saddlebag, her eyes sharp and dry. The dress bunched awkwardly around the legs of the horse, already streaked with dust from the chapel steps. The hem caught on the saddle horn. She didn't bother to fix it. The wind tore a thread loose and carried it off, unnoticed. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had thickened into night. Samuel dismounted first and lit the lantern by the barn. The glass had been cracked for years, but the flame inside flickered warm. In the soft light, he looked at her for the first time. Really looked. Her hair had come loose, strands clinging to her cheek with sweat and dust. Her face, though worn from the heat and the day, held itself with an odd stillness, like a painting hung slightly crooked. Not beautiful in the way people said in town, but in the way a river looks just before freezing over. Something suspended, waiting, quietly dangerous. He didn't ask why she came with him. She didn't ask what he expected her to do now. Samuel led her into the longhouse, opened the door with a slow creak that echoed off empty walls. Inside it smelled of wood smoke and old leather, with the faintest trace of cedar and iron. Sense of a man who had been alone too long. There was only one bed, tucked in the corner, built from rough pine and softened by a wool blanket patched at the edges. He pointed to it, then to himself, then to the rocking chair near the hearth. It was his way of saying she could take the bed. She didn't nod, just set her bag down by the window and began unlacing her boots, slow and deliberate. He left her there, stepping outside into the dark, where the stars cracked open overhead like scattered salt. The next morning, nothing was said. Samuel woke before dawn, as always, fed the chickens, then began working the fence out past the east pasture, where the cattle had started to press through. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't need to, but as he leaned into the post-hole digger, sweat already soaking through his shirt, he saw movement from the corner of his eye. Josephine was on the porch, barefoot, hair braided roughly down her back. She held a mug of coffee in both hands, his tin mug, and stared out across the land like she was trying to learn its language. By noon, she'd found the water pump, cleaned out the hearth, and begun hanging the laundry that had gone untouched for months. She moved through the house like someone who had lived there a lifetime ago and had just now come back, a woman not seeking permission, only purpose. Samuel watched from the barn window, didn't say a word. That evening, after a meal of eggs and cornbread she made without asking, they sat on the porch together. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, more like something waiting to settle. Out in the field, a sound broke the quiet. A soft, uncertain whinny. A small horse, not much more than a colt, really, limped through the tall grass, thin, skittish, ribs showing under a patchy chestnut coat. Its front leg was twisted just enough to slow it down, not enough to stop it. Josephine rose without hesitation. She crossed the field, moving slow, her hands at her sides. The horse twitched and backed away once, then again. She knelt in the grass and waited. Minutes passed. The colt stepped forward, curious. She held out her palm. Nothing in it. Then, from her pocket, an apple. She broke it in half with her hands, soft flesh splitting with a wet sound that carried across the stillness. The horse came closer. Samuel didn't move from the porch, but he watched. Every motion of hers, every twitch of the animal's legs. The way she stayed so still, even with her dress dragging in the burrs. Eventually, the colt nosed her hand, ate from it, and allowed her to place a hand on its jaw. She whispered something then, not words, just a tone. Low, kind, a melody for pain. That night, the horse slept in the barn, bedded in straw Samuel hadn't used since the year the cold killed half his herd. Josephine sat beside it until long after moonrise, stroking its neck with the gentleness of someone who had known what it meant to be left behind. Days passed like this, no talk of the chapel, no mention of names, just routine settling over them like silt in a quiet river. She washed clothes in the iron tub out back. He repaired the porch steps she tripped on. She left fresh biscuits on the windowsill. He refilled the woodpile before the first early frost. They moved around each other not like strangers, but like two hands learning how to fit again, calloused and unsure, but willing. Once she found an old photograph under the floorboard, a woman with dark hair and unreadable eyes, seated beside a man whose face had been scorched by time. She said nothing. Put it back. The floorboard creaked softly in reply. One night, thunderclouds rolled in low, bloated with promise. The smell of rain was heavy on the air, electric and deep. Samuel sat on the porch watching the lightning bloom across the horizon. Josephine stood just inside the doorway, backlit by lamplight, her silhouette framed in yellow and shadow. The wind tore a scrap of lace from the dress she hadn't changed out of. It caught on a nail, ripped down the side with a sound too soft for violence, too loud to ignore. Neither of them moved to fix it. The rain came just after midnight, a hard, aching rain that soaked the land and made the cattle bawl in the distance. Samuel stood in the doorway. Josephine sat in the rocking chair, her knees pulled to her chest, hair damp against her neck. They didn't speak, but for the first time, the silence between them felt full, not empty, like something beginning or something already begun. Morning came blue and slow, the kind of light that made shadows stretch thin and the air taste like metal. The storm had passed in the night, but the earth still held the weight of it. Wet soil clinging to boots, the scent of juniper sharp in the air. Somewhere on the ridge, a lone hawk cried once, then vanished into silence. Inside the longhouse, Samuel Cutter sat by the wood stove, rolling a strip of rawhide between his fingers. The room was warm, smelling of rain-damp wool and old tobacco. He'd lit a fire out of habit, though the morning air didn't truly ask for it. Habit was what he had left. That and the quiet. Behind him, soft footsteps. Josephine crossed the floor barefoot, her dress hiked slightly above her ankles, sleeves rolled. She didn't look at him, just poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table. Steam curled into the beams above, and the window panes trembled faintly in the breeze. She took to daily life without ceremony, without asking. Samuel never told her where the flour was kept. She found it anyway. He never offered the axe. One morning, she was splitting kindling in the yard, sleeves dark with sweat, strands of hair sticking to her face. He watched through the barn slats and didn't speak. It wasn't partnership, not in any way folks would understand. It was a sort of alignment. like two shadows at sunset, distinct but leaning in the same direction. Days unspooled quietly. Each morning, Josephine opened the shutters, shook out the rugs, fed the chickens without flinching when they pecked her skirts. She moved through the house like someone trying not to wake a sleeping god. Samuel worked the land, mending fences, hauling water, branding calves. He returned each evening with the dust on his shoulders and dried blood on his hands from wire or horn. She never asked how the cattle fared, never asked where he'd been, but his supper was always warm. One afternoon, she stood over the table sewing a torn bedsheet. He was whittling a broken pitchfork handle back into shape. The sound of her thread pulling through the cloth matched the rhythm of his knife against wood. Back and forth, two lives stitched into silence. Later that week, the colt, the one with the twisted leg, stumbled hard in the barn and cut itself along the flank. Blood soaked into the straw like rust in water. Josephine found it first, crouched beside the animal before Samuel returned from the fields. He entered the barn to find her sleeves rolled high, a strip of clean cloth pressed firm to the wound. The horse whimpered but didn't fight. She looked up when he approached, her eyes calm but lit from within by some quiet urgency. Samuel took the lantern down and set it near. Wordlessly, he brought a tin basin and filled it with the bitter-smelling liquor they used for wounds. She held the colt steady while he cleaned the gash. Their hands brushed once, brief and unintentional, and neither pulled away. The stitching took half the night. Josephine held the colt's head, whispering low. Samuel stitched slow and clean. No wasted movement. When they finished, she leaned back against the hay bales, her palms red, her shoulders streaked with sweat. He looked at her then, not in that quick, sidelong way of a man stealing glances, but fully, saw the lines beneath her eyes, the way her dress clung to her ribs, the way silence didn't seem to frighten her. They didn't speak, but when he offered his hand to help her stand, she took it. A week later, Samuel found her by the creek, kneeling in the sand. She'd carried the cracked wash basin from the house, filled it with river stones. When he drew closer, she didn't startle. She gestured toward the stones, smooth, round, each one wrapped in twine and scrap cloth. "What's it for?" he asked, her first words in days. "Wait," she said simply, "for the bottom of the curtain." She didn't smile when she said it, but her voice was calm, and he remembered how rare sound was from her. He nodded. Later that night, she hung the curtain from the single window in the kitchen. It swayed in the wind like something trying not to leave. One day, in the early gray of dawn, he found her planting something in the small plot near the barn. The earth was dry, but she'd soaked it with water from the pump, her sleeves muddy to the elbows. Bent at the waist, she worked each hole with care. He watched from the porch. She didn't look back, but she said, "Lavender?" He didn't respond, didn't need to, but something in him settled. He brought her a shovel without being asked. Summer stretched on. The colt's leg healed slow, but sure. It began following Josephine across the yard, its gait uneven but eager, ears twitching when she sang softly under her breath. Samuel saw her once, pressing her cheek to its flank, her eyes closed like she was listening to something inside it. At night, the two of them sat by the fire, each in their own silence. Samuel with his leather work, Josephine tracing the frayed hem of the dress she never stopped wearing. They didn't speak of the chapel, didn't speak of the man who hadn't come. But one night, she stood and crossed the room to the shelf above his desk. She reached up, slow, unhurried, and moved a tin box aside, placing her own there instead. A small one, worn leather, wrapped in twine. He didn't ask what was in it. She didn't offer. But the act itself was enough, quiet, permanent, a piece of herself, stored among his. By late August, the lavender began to sprout, pale green fingers pushing through the dirt, fragile but persistent. Josephine knelt beside them each morning, whispering something the wind never caught. Samuel watched her from the porch, sipping coffee gone cold. He'd begun to carve her a chair, pine, smooth-backed, simple. He didn't measure it, just made it to fit the way she sat in his. One morning, as the sun cracked low over the plains, he placed it by the door without a word. She saw it, didn't touch it that day. But the next morning she was sitting in it, humming under her breath, the colt asleep beside her feet. And that night, when the wind rattled the house and the stars went sharp above the roof, she came to bed and lay beside him, still dressed, still guarded, but there. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, but she didn't leave. And in the space between them, the silence grew warm. The land began to dry again. September drew its fingers across the plains, leaving the grass brittle, the sky sharpened to a thin blue blade. The lavender by the barn drooped in the heat, stubborn against the season. Dust returned like a memory too old to forget. Samuel Cutter rose each morning with the sun, the same ritual: boots, coffee, step onto the porch. The same world, silent and wide, waiting to be met. But now, she was there, Josephine. Most mornings she was already outside, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, washing a pot with river water, or standing barefoot by the horses, her figure blurred by heat rising off the ground. The colt, now steadier on its legs, trailed behind her like a dog, loyal and uncertain. They still hadn't spoken of what brought her here or what held her, but some things had changed. He'd carved a second hook by the door, and her shawl hung from it. She'd moved the plates to a lower shelf, one she could reach easier. One night, when coyotes howled from the ridge and the colt spooked in the barn, they stood together under the stars, her shoulder brushing his, as they watched the dark for shapes that never came. And still, they hadn't touched, not in that way. They lived beside each other like two prayers whispered in different languages, heard by the same sky. The news came with dust on a rider's coat. A boy no older than 16, lean and sharp-eyed, arrived at the gate mid-morning. His horse trembled with heat and distance. Samuel met him near the fence post, arms folded, a line of sweat beneath his collar. "Letter," the boy said, "from Calico Bluff." Samuel didn't move to take it. "It's from the one that left her," the boy added. A glance flicked toward the longhouse. "That man's back in town." Samuel took the envelope without a word. He didn't open it. That night, the letter burned slowly in the stove. The flames licked the edges without hurry. Josephine stood nearby, drying her hands on a cloth. She didn't ask what it said. She watched the fire until only curled ash remained, then turned away and resumed her quiet work, as if nothing important had been lost. But something shifted between them, a tautness, like a fence pulled too tight. The next day, Samuel saddled Hollow and rode into Calico Bluff alone. The town hadn't changed much. Dust still swept the boardwalk, the same crooked sign over the saloon. The church doors hung open, cracked and sun-bleached. But the air was different, tighter, like something held its breath just beneath the surface. Samuel stepped into the saloon, boots heavy on the floor. Men glanced up, then away. At the far end, near the back, sat the man. Slick-haired, face sunburnt and ruddy, dressed like a banker playing cowboy. James Whitley, that was his name. Josephine had never said it. But Samuel remembered now. He was talking too loud, already drunk, a woman on his lap who wasn't listening. "That rancher took what's mine," he slurred. "She was meant for me. Walks out with her like it's a cattle auction. No papers, no promises, just dust and pride." His laughter was brittle. Samuel didn't approach. He simply watched from the shadows, long enough to see what sort of man this was, how hollow his voice was when no one leaned in to hear him. When the woman on his lap excused herself, Whitley looked around, eyes glassy. "They say she lives out there now, with him, on his land, like she belongs." He said it not like a man mourning a loss, but like someone missing a prize. Samuel stepped out before he was seen. The saloon door creaked softly behind him. No words, no confrontation. He didn't believe in fighting for a name that had never been his to begin with. He returned home before dusk. The prairie golden stretched beneath his horse like an old sheet. Wind in the grass, sky heavy with sun. Josephine was on the porch, bent over her lavender plants, their stems crisped at the edges. She didn't look up as he dismounted, didn't ask. But that night, when they sat by the hearth, she moved closer, close enough their arms brushed, and when he rose to latch the door, she followed him to the threshold. Outside, the wind shifted, footsteps in the distance, one horse. A silhouette on the trail, weaving slightly, a shape familiar in its wrongness. James Whitley. He didn't come shouting. He came slow, tired, more drunk than brave, stopped 10 yards from the porch. "I came to take her back," he called. The colt in the barn stirred. Samuel stepped forward, down from the porch, slow and even. He didn't reach for a rifle, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, broad shoulders lit by the lantern's glow, his shadow long and still. Whitley saw something in him, something wordless, final, a kind of silence that weighed more than any threat, that said, "You've already lost." The man swayed, hesitated, laughed once, a bitter sound too small for the night. Then he turned his horse and left. Samuel stood there until the hoofbeats faded. When he stepped back into the house, Josephine was sitting at the table, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on the floor. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the cracks in the wood, carrying the scent of lavender and blood. But the night passed without noise, without fear. And when Samuel woke before dawn, her shawl was still on the hook. The colt slept by the porch, and the longhouse held its quiet like a breath finally let go. The frost came early that year, first as a whisper in the mornings, then a hush laid over the fields by night. The grass crisped, the wind grew sharper. Cracks in the longhouse walls breathed cold into the room before the fire was lit. But the quiet held, and Josephine stayed. She'd begun waking before Samuel now. A soft clatter of kindling, the scrape of the stove door, the scent of coffee before he'd opened his eyes. Her rhythm folded into his without effort, the way two notes sometimes form a single deeper sound when played together. By the time he stepped onto the porch each morning, she'd already be outside, her breath white in the dawn, a basket on her hip, boots cutting clean lines through the frost-bitten grass. The colt, now stronger, steadier, followed her still, though it had stopped limping weeks ago. The lavender plants had browned at the tips. Some were gone, eaten by deer or wilted by sun and wind, but she kept planting. A few stalks here, a new row along the path to the barn, no complaint. Just the steady work of someone who needed her hands in the earth. Samuel didn't ask why she planted them in autumn. He figured she knew something he didn't. One morning, he found her barefoot in the field, toes curled into frozen dirt, sleeves damp with river water. She was kneeling, head bowed, a basket of cuttings beside her. The colt stood a few paces behind, its breath puffing clouds into the still air. Samuel watched from the porch. The way she touched the ground, deliberate, reverent, not planting, but placing, a slow ritual, like she was laying something to rest or calling something back. He remembered suddenly how his wife used to hum when she kneaded bread, how she never said grace before meals, but always touched her fingers to the edge of the table like she was thanking it. Quiet gestures. Women had their own ways of prayer. He didn't disturb her. When she came back inside, her cheeks were red with cold. She shed her shawl at the door, poured herself coffee, and sat across from him without speaking. But she left her gloves on the table between them, palms up, fingers still holding the shape of her hands. And for once, he reached for them, not the gloves, her hands. She didn't pull away. The days shortened. Shadows grew longer. They settled deeper into the rhythm, feeding the animals, repairing the barn roof before snowfall, patching worn clothes, pressing apples for cider. The little things. The dailiness of being near someone without needing to speak. Samuel built her a shelf by the window, for her tins, her thread, for nothing in particular. She swept the floor without being asked. He watched her do both, without interruption. One night, she placed a single stalk of lavender on the table before supper. Dried, brittle, gray at the edges, its scent faint but stubborn. Neither of them said a word about it. But he left it there, and it stayed, even when the others crumbled or were brushed away. Winter came with a hard wind. Snow fell early and often, the sky always low and gray. The longhouse darkened, their world shrank to the rooms they could warm, the steps between barn and porch, and still they didn't touch more than necessary. Once, when she slipped on ice carrying water, he caught her elbow. Firm, sure, brief. She steadied. They looked at each other. That was all. Another time she woke coughing in the night, and he brought her a damp cloth for her forehead. She pressed her face into his palm without speaking. Small things. A kind of nearness more permanent than declarations. And then spring crept in. Not loud, just a slow easing of cold. The first time she opened the window again, the wind smelled of melting snow and wet pine. Birds returned. The sky softened. The colt began running again. Strong, wide arcs in the pasture, tail high. She laughed once, watching it. Just once. He remembered the sound for hours after. One morning, Samuel found her by the barn again, barefoot, kneeling, a new lavender stalk in her hand, but this time she wasn't planting. She was moving them. Carefully, she dug a new bed just below the kitchen window, rich soil she'd prepared for weeks. Row by row, she transferred the plants, their roots curled with memory. When he approached, she looked up. "I wanted them here," she said softly. "Where I'll see them from inside." He nodded. Then, after a pause, "You think they'll take?" She ran her fingers over the roots. "I think they already have." That evening, she wore his shirt to feed the chickens. It hung loose on her, sleeves rolled, buttons undone at the collar. She didn't look at him, just moved through the yard like she belonged there, like she always had. The colt followed at a distance, kicking frost off the grass with light steps. Inside, the fire burned steady. The smell of coffee and ash and pine filled the room. He stood at the window and watched her move through the light. No words were spoken, none needed. This was not a marriage in name. There were no vows, no paper, no preacher's blessing. But she lived in his space, tended his soil, left her gloves on his table, and he carved her a chair, made room for her silence, lit the stove before she rose. That was enough. That was the answer to every question they'd never asked. The last scene was this: a pale morning, sky washed clean. Josephine, barefoot in the mud, hands black with earth, planting the last of the lavender beneath a window framed in pine. Samuel Cutter on the porch, one leg crossed over the other, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes soft with something not quite joy but close. No music, no speech, only the wind, only the colt grazing near the fence, only a woman in a borrowed shirt, bringing color back to dead soil, and a man watching, not to protect, not to possess, just to remember and to stay.